For those of you who don't know me, my name's Stephen. I'm the children and youth worker here. And for those of you who know me as well, you know that my surname is Baker. But although I'm a baker by name, I do very little baking in real life. I enjoy cooking, but I don't bake much. Believe it or not, about 7 years ago, I did a GCSE in baking. I took food tech, and you could choose one of 4 options, and I chose to do baking. So I did a GCSE in baking. That's probably where my baking career ended. We had to choose like 10 different products and kind of adapt them and change them a little bit. One of the favorite things I made was these apple and toffee muffins, which had these chunks of toffee inside, which melted in the oven. They were quite nice. I was quite proud of them. But I have very vivid memories of a few days later, bringing them home, being quite happy with them, going to eat one, and then realizing that it basically gone off. To save you the details, the fruit inside had gone rotten. It wasn't very pleasant. It went in the bin. On the outside, it looked great, but its looks were deceiving. It was rotten and destined for one place. But in our passage today, we've got a much more extreme case of looks being deceiving. In the great Babylon who rides upon the beast, this prostitute that represents godless living looks beautiful at first, but as we read, she is rotten and destined for one place. We're going to see Babylon from heaven's point of view. We're going to see godless, idolatrous living from heaven's point of view. Now, Revelation as a book is steeped in Old Testament history. A lot of the imagery and pictures we see aren't random, but are picked from the Old Testament. God deliberately uses them, and we're to think back, we're to cast our minds back. And to understand who Babylon is, we need to go way back to the start, to Genesis 11 and the Tower of Babel. You don't need to turn there. I'll summarize what happens. But early on in the days of man, just after the flood, the men of the world say, they find this big open plain, and they say, we're going to build a tower all the way up to the heavens. Now, the offense isn't making a tower, but the offense is them trying to make themselves God. Their aim was to reach up to the heavens, to put themselves in God's place. It was to challenge God's rightful rule and to say, we want to rule over ourselves. The Tower of Babel is the original Babylon. It's godless living, living in idolatry, making ourselves God. Centuries later, on that same site where the Tower of Babel was built, Babylon, the empire, is constructed. Babylon, again, is painted in the Old Testament as this picture of godless living. It's the opposite of Jerusalem, which is God's chosen city. And we read in 1 Chronicles 9 that Babylon took Israel captive. They made them slaves because of Israel's sin. Throughout the Old Testament, Babylon is a prime example of godless living, of living in rejection of God's rightful rule. In its simplest form, Babylon is idolatry personified. It's mankind making themselves or other things God and rejecting God's rule. And the idea of Babylon being godless living carries on in Revelation, which we see here in Babylon the prostitute. So as the vision carries on that John sees, one of the angels who's with John says, come, I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute. And in verse 2, he's taken out into the desert to see this great prostitute. And as he sees her, the name on her head, we read in verse 5, is Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. We read that she's dressed in purple, this royal color. She's adorned with precious stones and jewels. At first glance, if those are all the verses we had, we might dare say she's attractive. The way she appears, the way she's adorned, at first sense, is strangely attractive. And the same can be said for godless living, for living in idolatry. At first glance, us being in charge of ourselves sounds quite a good idea, especially in the West, where we cherish ideas of personal freedom, that I alone can decide what I can and can't do. At first glance, godless living seems attractive. But come and see Babylon, godless living, from heaven's point of view, from God's point of view. In the golden cup that the prostitute holds, as we read on, is not the finest of wines, but the filth of her abominations. The name on her head is Mother of Prostitutes, abominations of the earth. But perhaps the vilest image comes in chapter 17, verse 6, where John looks closer and realizes that she is drunk, but not drunk on wine, but on the blood of the saints, on the blood of Christians. This prostitute Babylon, her looks are deceiving. At first glance, she is beautiful, But as we look closer and see from heaven's point of view, she is vile and rotten. She may be adorned with jewels and diamonds, but they're soaked red by the blood of the saints. She may look royal, but she is the source of abominations of evil on the earth. Looks can be deceiving, and Babylon, godless living, may at first glance seem attractive, but is rotten and vile and evil. And this is how God sees idolatry and rejection of God, as this vile prostitute, drunk on the blood of the martyrs. And we should be rightly shocked. The image should make our stomachs turn a little bit. But we might be thinking, that's an awfully strong description of idolatry. Idolatry is one of these sins that we're kind of okay with. Putting something in God's place, we're kind of okay with that. It's something that we don't always feel the true weight of. But here we see in Revelation that idolatry is worse than we can imagine. The news is far worse than we could ever imagine. A few years ago now, one of my friends from Coventry, he was complaining of a slight backache. It was nothing major. He felt it was just that he was getting old. He went to the doctors and carried on for a while, and turns out he had a slipped disc and needed emergency surgery straight away. The news was far worse than you could have ever imagined. The news was far different to the reality that he felt. And it's the same with idolatry, with godless living. It's worse than we can imagine, hence the description we get here of Babylon. We'll keep coming back to chapter 17, verse 2 today, but it's helpful here again. We read, "With her the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries." When we engage in idolatry, we commit adultery on God. It's far worse than we can imagine. But before we see where this godless living is destined, there's more to this picture. For Babylon isn't on her own, but she sat on a beast over many waters. So come and see the beast and the waters from heaven's point of view. If we describe the prostitute as vile, then we can sum up the beast as terrifying. In verse 3, we read that she sat on a scarlet beast covered in blasphemous names, who has 7 heads and 10 horns. We get this picture of a huge monstrosity of a creature, huge and hulking, which she sat upon. And we saw this beast before. Back in chapter 13, a few weeks ago now, we saw this beast, the beast from the sea. They're given the same description of 7 heads and 10 horns. And we saw that the beast from the sea, the same one here, represents anti-God authority. And that's the same in our passage. This beast represents anti-God authority. Kings or kingdoms or empires that suppress God's truth and promote idolatry. And again, it's the same here. The beast that we have is made up of kings and kingdoms and power. In verse 9, we read that the 7 heads represent 7 kings. 5 of these kings have been, 1 is, and 1 is to come. The 7 heads also represent 7 hills or mountains, which are statuses of power or symbols of power and status. The beast who upholds Babylon is made up of powerful kings and kingdoms and rulers. The beast is anti-God authority. And the beast is also set up as a parody of Christ's reign. It's a bit of a complex point, but look with me at verse 8, where the beast is described who what was, now is not, and yet will come up again. It's a strikingly similar description we get of God in chapter 4 of Revelation, of verse 8, where he's described the God who was and is to come. That description of God is parodied by the beast. He's almost competing against God's rule. The beast, anti-God authority, is competing against God's rule. It's a parody of God's rightful rule, set up as his opponent, challenging him. So if the beast represents anti-God authority, we might ask, well, which type of authority does it represent? Who in history is it a picture of? And we can, and rightly so, compare it to Rome at the time. So when John wrote this book, when the vision was given to him, Rome was the ruling superpower, and it owned a lot of the known world, and it was very much the Babylon of its day. It was godless living personified in its day. And the description seems to fit well as well, because we read the beast's 7 heads are also 7 hills in verse 9, and Rome was famously quoted to be built on 7 hills. But the description of this beast isn't limited to Rome. Christians at any point in history have been able to identify past, present, and possible future kingdoms who persecute God's people. The beast represents all godless authority in all history, all the kingdoms, empires, and rulers who have attempted to remove God. But the real thrust of this passage, the main idea we're to get from the beast, is that he is powerful. These are kings and hills and mountains, and the 10 horns, they're also signs of power. The point is that this anti-God rule in any time in history is powerful. And while Babylon is sat on the beast, she is not the one in control, but instead the beast holds up Babylon. Anti-God authority holds up godless living in an attempt to draw people away from God. This beast that represents anti-God authority holds up idolatry. And we see that worked out in real godless rule. Be that an actual person or a dictator in a totalitarian state who demands worship of themselves as a god, or be that a society that promotes the pursuit of wealth and comfort above all things, godless authority holds out godless living to pull people away from God. I have 2 younger cousins who are now not very young anymore. They're 9 and 7, but I got to watch them grow up. It was quite fun. Kind of the first real kids I'd seen grow up. And one thing I learned about babies is they have a surprisingly strong grip strength. When they hold on to something and don't want to let it go, you cannot get it out of their hand. So the main way we got it out, if they were holding something they weren't meant to have, is to tempt them with something else. You offer them something else to hold, and then they finally let go. And that seems to be what this anti-God authority is doing here. It's holding up a tempting offer of the prostitute. It's holding out idolatry, saying, will you take this? Will you let go of God's rightful rule and take this idolatry instead? Now, we might be thinking, surely that strategy is not very effective. We've seen how vile this prostitute is. Surely the nations won't buy into that. Surely people won't be so foolish to pursue idolatry. But that's not what God sees from heaven's point of view. In verse 15, we read that the waters she is sat by are peoples, multitudes, nations of all different languages. Babylon, the prostitute, rules over the nations of the world. Despite her vileness, the nations have run after her. And as we read in verse 18 of chapter 17, just over the page, the woman you saw is a great city. She rules over the kings of the earth. Babylon rules over the world. It's a very effective strategy. The world is drunk on idolatry. Come and see the sway of Babylon and the beast she sits upon from heaven's point of view. So we've seen Babylon in history. We've seen current Babylon today that's held up by godless authority, promoting idolatry, be that in a person or in things to pursue. But come and see the fate of Babylon. Come and see history from heaven's point of view. And remember, looks are deceiving. She looks powerful, she looks beautiful, but her fate is sealed. Verse 16 of chapter 17 is suddenly a jarring contrast. Before, it seems that the beast and the prostitute are allies. They're promoting idolatry. But then there's division in the ranks. In verse 16, we read that these 10 kings, which we're going to get onto in a minute, will hate the prostitute. They will kill her, burn her remains, completely destroy her. You might be thinking, well, what's going on there? There's division amongst the enemy. And I think that's very much the point, that there is division amongst the enemy. A kingdom that is founded on promoting godless rule and godless living and godless authority cannot stand. It will crumble on itself. And we've seen this all through history. Babylon, the actual physical empire that subjected Israel, crumbled eventually. And Rome, the Babylon of the day when John was around, crumbled on itself. Despite their parodying of Christ's everlasting reign, a kingdom built on godless rule and idolatry will not stand. So the beast destroys Babylon, but then does that mean the beast wins? Is he the all-powerful one here? Well, no, definitely not. If we go back over the page to verse 12, we'll have a look at a few verses. We read that the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings. who have not yet received the kingdom, but who for 1 hour will receive authority as kings along with the beast. We're told that there are these 10 future kings to come who haven't been given a kingdom, who will rule alongside the beast or will promote godless authority. Who these 10 kings are, I don't think there's quite a point in the passage. We could spend all day trying to pick out kingdoms and kings and rulers who are these 10 kings who promote godless living and rule in a godless way. But I think really the point is that the world is ruled godlessly. 10 is the number of completion and power and revelation, and the beast and its kings represent the godless rule of the world. And they will wage war against the Lamb. Or in other words, they will challenge his rightful reign. But in a frankly climatic way, as we saw earlier with the kids lot in verse 13 to 14, they're completely defeated. We read in verse 13, they have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast. They will wage war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will triumph over them because he is Lord of lords and King of kings. I've decided that this final battle wouldn't make good TV. A while ago now, a TV series was released called The Mandalorian, which is a Star Wars TV series. Lots of people were raging on about it, so I went to watch it. And I found it just incredibly frustrating. The hero of the story seemed completely inept. He just about got through everything. He couldn't quite do what he was meant to do. But it made good TV. The struggle he had made a good story. It made good TV. But here's the complete opposite with Jesus. Our hero, Jesus, doesn't struggle to defeat his enemies, but despite all their power and their mass and their monstrosity, they are defeated in one sentence. For Jesus is the King of kings. Who is the king of these kings of godless authority? It's Jesus. Jesus is the king of these kings, and on that last day, godless rule will not stand. So we've seen the fate of Babylon. That godless living, godless rule will not stand. Her fate is sealed. And as chapter 18 starts, a mighty voice shouts from heaven, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons and a haunt for every impure spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird and every detestable animal. For all the nations have drunk the maddening wine of her adulteries. The kings of the earth committed adultery with her, and the merchants of the earth grew rich from her excessive luxuries. The fate of Babylon is sealed, ruin and destruction. This is where Babylon, godless living, idolatrous living, is headed. And those who continue to live in Babylon, who continue to live a godless life, who reject God's rightful rule, their fate is sealed too. Babylon and her residents will be met with destruction. If we look over a few verses to verse 21 and 23 of chapter 18, we read, then a mighty angel picked up a boulder the size of a large millstone and threw it into the sea and said, with such violence, the great city of Babylon will be thrown down, never to be found again. Music of harpists and musicians and pipers and trumpeters will never be heard in you again. No worker of any trade will ever be found in you again. The sound of a millstone will never be heard in you again. The light of a lamp will never shine in you again. The voice of a bridegroom and bride will never be heard in you again. The Babylon's fate is sealed and is total. It's complete destruction. On that last day, godless living, godless rule will not stand. Its fate is sealed in utter destruction. And this leaves us with one big main point, really, in verse 4 of chapter 18, when God calls from heaven and says, come out of her, my people. Come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues. For her sins are piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes. Really, God is asking us this question. Is this the woman you love? Is this woman, Babylon, the prostitute, the horrors of godless living, is this the woman you love? Is this the one you're going to give your life to? Often, idolatry is hard to spot, mainly because when we make good things, God things. It's good gifts that God has given us, and we make them God things. So it's difficult to spot. We don't feel the true weight of it. We don't see how serious idolatry is. But here, God has revealed the true nature of idolatry. To engage in idolatry is to engage in adultery. It is cheating on God and his rightful rule. God is showing us what our idolatry looks like. And the question for us, brothers and sisters, is this: is this the woman you love? Is this really the woman you love? Come and see Babylon, godless living from heaven's point of view. Is this really the woman you love? For who you love will decide your fate. If this is the woman you love, you will share in her fate. Come and see Babylon, our idolatry, from heaven's point of view. But notice who God's talking to in verse 4. It's quite important. In verse 4, he says, "Come out of her, my people." God's call goes to his people, a people that he owns, a people that he has brought back. And if you are trusting in Christ and you are part of this people, you are part of God's people that he has brought back through Jesus, through the risen, victorious Lamb. And therefore you are no longer in relationship with this prostitute, but with God himself. You're not in relationship with this prostitute, but have been made part of the bride that Christ died for. You are part of his people. If you are trusting in Christ, you are no longer in a relationship with a prostitute that leads to utter destruction, but with God the Father, which leads to complete eternal safety. When we see our idolatry as it is, that is adultery against the one who has brought us back, and we see the fate of Babylon, that is utter destruction, we're to be reminded to flee Babylon. Come out of her, my people. No longer engage in adultery with this prostitute that will lead you to destruction. But come back to your God, who in his love brought you out of Babylon, out of the destruction she faces. Come and see Babylon from heaven's point of view. Come and see it as she really is, a vile prostitute, the mother of all abominations, and come see her fate, utter destruction. And as we see Babylon for what she is, let us come out of her. Let us do away with our idolatry, our erecting of anything else in God's place. Let us have nothing to do with her. For we are God's people, brought back by the blood of the Lamb, rescued from the destruction we used to face. And let us not return to her. Let us not commit adultery on the one who made us his own, rescuing us through Christ from relationship with this vile prostitute to relationship with him in safety forever. Her looks are deceiving. She looks beautiful. She looks powerful. But come and see Babylon, godless living, for what she is worth, for her fate is sealed.